There's a specific kind of person who can't let a question sit unanswered, not because they're particularly studious or because they love learning in some pure abstract way, but because not knowing feels like standing on the edge of something, like being caught without a map in a place that might turn dangerous at any moment. If you've ever found yourself 3 hours deep into a Wikipedia spiral at 2 a.m., not because you were bored, but because you genuinely needed to understand how tardigrades survive in space or why certain metals conduct electricity better than others, even though none of it has anything to do with your actual life, then you already know the feeling I'm talking about. It's not curiosity in the way people usually mean it. It's something sharper, more urgent, almost compulsive. And here's the thing most people don't realize about this behavior. It's not random. It's not just a quirky personality trait or a sign that you're intellectual or detail-oriented. It's often a response, a deeply ingrained pattern that formed long before you were old enough to notice it was happening. Because somewhere back there, in the formative years when your brain was still learning how the world worked, you learned something very specific. You learned that being unprepared was dangerous, that not knowing could get you hurt. That being caught off guard meant being vulnerable in a way that felt unbearable. Maybe it was a parent whose mood could shift without warning, and you had to become a detective of microexpressions just to survive the day without setting something off. Maybe it was an environment where asking questions was met with irritation or dismissal, so you learned to find the answers on your own, quietly, in the background. Maybe it was a world that felt chaotic and unpredictable, and information became the only thing you could hold on to that made you feel like you had some control. Whatever the specifics were, the pattern is the same. You learned that knowledge equaled safety, that understanding meant you wouldn't be blindsided, that if you could just know enough, anticipate enough, research enough, you could protect yourself from the terrible feeling of being caught without the right answer. And so the brain did what brains do. It adapted. It built a system, a reflex, a way of moving through the world that prioritized information gathering above almost everything else. And that system worked. At least, it worked well enough to get you through childhood. Well enough to make you feel like you had some agency in a situation where you otherwise had very little. But like most childhood adaptations, it didn't just disappear when the threat did. It stayed. It became part of how you think, part of how you approach uncertainty, part of who you are. Now, as an adult, that same mechanism shows up in ways that might seem completely unrelated to the original context. You can't watch a movie without looking up the director's entire filmography halfway through. You can't have a casual conversation without mentally cataloging facts to verify later. Someone mentions a concept you're unfamiliar with, and even if it's not important, even if it doesn't matter at all, you feel this pull, this need to go home and research it until you understand it fully. Not because you're going to use the information, not because anyone expects you to, but because not knowing feels like a gap, a vulnerability, a small crack in the armor you've been building your entire life. And here's where it gets interesting. Most people think this behavior is about intelligence, about being smart or curious or having a thirst for knowledge. And sure, those things might be part of it, but the real engine underneath? It's not intellectual, it's emotional. It's the part of you that still remembers what it felt like to not have the information you needed when it mattered. The part that learned very early on that surprises are almost never good. That uncertainty doesn't lead to discovery. It leads to exposure, to being caught unprepared, to that very specific kind of shame that comes from not knowing something you feel like you should have known. There's a term in psychology for this, hypervigilance. It's most commonly associated with trauma, particularly the kind that involves unpredictability. When a child grows up in an environment where they can't reliably predict what's going to happen next, their nervous system adapts by staying in a state of heightened alertness, always scanning, always monitoring, always preparing for the next shift. And one of the ways that hypervigilance manifests, especially in people who are more cognitively oriented, is through compulsive information seeking. Because information is a form of control. It's a way to reduce the number of variables, to make the world feel just a little bit more manageable. But here's the paradox. The more you research, the more you realize how much you don't know. And instead of that being liberating, instead of it feeling like exploration, it often feels like falling behind, like you're trying to drink from a fire hose that never stops, because the goal was never really to know everything. The goal was to feel safe. And safety, it turns out, isn't something you can research your way into. Think about the last time you went down one of these research spirals. What was the feeling underneath it? Was it genuine curiosity? Or was it something closer to anxiety, a kind of restlessness that wouldn't let you move on until you'd satisfied some internal need for completeness? And when you finally did find the answer, did it feel satisfying? Or did it just lead to another question and then another until you were so far removed from the original topic that you couldn't even remember why you started? That's the loop. And it's not a loop you can logic your way out of. Because the problem isn't that you don't have enough information. The problem is that information has become the language your nervous system speaks when it's trying to say something else entirely. When it's trying to say, I don't feel prepared. I don't feel safe. I don't trust that I'll be okay if I don't know what's coming. And the thing is, you probably are more knowledgeable than most people. You probably do know a lot of random disconnected facts that serve no practical purpose, but that you can recall with perfect clarity. You probably are the person people turn to when they need something explained or fact-checked or researched. And on the surface, that looks like competence. It looks like intelligence. But underneath, it often feels like something else. Like a job you didn't apply for but can't quit. Like a responsibility you carry that no one else seems to notice. There's also a social dimension to this that's worth naming. Because people who compulsively research things often do it alone, quietly, in the background. It's not performative. It's not about showing off what you know. In fact, you probably downplay it most of the time. Because the research isn't for other people. It's for you. It's the thing you do to feel like you have a handle on the world. To feel like you won't be caught off guard. To feel like you're not walking into something blind. But that also means that the benefits of all that knowledge are mostly internal and often invisible. You know things that help you navigate conversations more smoothly, avoid mistakes, anticipate problems, make connections other people miss. But because that all happens inside your head, because it's all part of your internal processing, it doesn't usually get recognized or valued in the way that more visible forms of competence do. So you end up in this strange position where you're doing all this cognitive labor, carrying all this information, and yet somehow still feeling like you're not quite prepared enough. Like you're always one piece of information away from being truly ready. And here's the really difficult part. At some point, you start to realize that the research itself has become a form of avoidance. That by staying in the information gathering phase, you can delay the part where you actually have to act, where you have to make a decision with incomplete information. Where you have to trust yourself to handle whatever comes without having studied every possible outcome first. Because as long as you're still researching, you're still in control. You're still safe. You haven't made the mistake yet. You haven't been caught unprepared. You're still doing the thing that your brain learned would protect you. But life doesn't wait for you to finish your research, and the world doesn't slow down just because you need more time to prepare. And at some point, the very thing that was supposed to keep you safe starts to keep you stuck because you can't move forward if you're always gathering more information. You can't make decisions if you're always waiting for certainty. And you can't really be present in your life if part of you is always somewhere else, researching the next thing, preparing for the next possibility, trying to cover the next gap in your knowledge. Now, I want to be very clear about something. This isn't about stopping yourself from being curious. It's not about becoming less thoughtful or less thorough or less engaged with the world. Those are real strengths. And the fact that you care about understanding things deeply, that you notice details other people miss, that you make connections that aren't obvious, those are valuable traits. The problem isn't the curiosity. The problem is when the curiosity is being driven by anxiety. When the research is less about genuine interest and more about trying to manage a feeling of unease that never quite goes away. And the tricky thing is, from the outside, those two things can look identical. Someone who's genuinely curious and someone who's compulsively researching out of anxiety might engage with information in very similar ways. The difference is internal. It's in the feeling underneath the behavior. One feels expansive, open, energizing. The other feels tight, urgent, almost obligatory. And if you're honest with yourself, you probably know which one yours is most of the time. There's also this. The brain that learned to seek information as a survival strategy is also a brain that's incredibly good at pattern recognition, at synthesizing disparate pieces of information into coherent narratives, at seeing connections that aren't immediately obvious. Those are skills, real, valuable skills. But they come at a cost. Because that same brain also has a hard time turning off. It's always processing, always analyzing, always scanning for the thing it might have missed, and that's exhausting, not in a way that's always visible, but in a way that accumulates, that builds over time, until you realize you're tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. And here's something people don't talk about enough. When you grow up learning that you need to have all the answers, you also grow up believing that not knowing is a personal failure. That uncertainty is something to be ashamed of. That asking for help or admitting you don't understand something is a sign of weakness. And so you carry this double burden. Not only do you feel compelled to research everything, you also feel like you have to do it alone. Like reaching out, like saying, I don't know, like trusting someone else's expertise instead of verifying it yourself would somehow be letting your guard down in a way that's not safe. But the irony is that isolation actually makes you more vulnerable. Because when you're operating entirely from your own research, your own understanding, your own internal fact-checking system, you're missing out on the collective knowledge and perspective that comes from collaboration, from conversation, from admitting that you don't have to be the sole authority on everything, that it's okay to not know, that other people can be trusted to fill in the gaps, that you don't have to carry all of this by yourself. I think one of the most painful realizations for people who operate this way is recognizing how much energy they spent trying to feel prepared for things that never happened. How many hours went into researching scenarios that never materialized? How much cognitive load they've carried trying to anticipate every possible outcome, only to have life unfold in ways they never could have predicted anyway? Not because the research was useless, but because control is never really the point. Safety was. And safety, real safety, doesn't come from knowing everything. It comes from trusting that you'll be okay even when you don't. That's the shift that has to happen. Not from being curious to being indifferent, but from researching out of fear to engaging with information out of genuine interest. From needing to know in order to feel safe, to wanting to know because the world is fascinating. And that shift doesn't happen overnight. It's not a switch you flip. It's a slow, often uncomfortable process of learning to tolerate uncertainty, of sitting with the feeling of not knowing and realizing that it doesn't actually destroy you, that you can be caught off guard and still be okay, that you can make decisions with incomplete information and survive the outcome, that you are more resilient than the part of you that needs to research everything believes you are. And maybe the most important part of all of this is recognizing that the version of you that developed this pattern was doing the best they could with what they had. That child who learned to become an expert in reading the room, in gathering information, in preparing for every possible outcome, was trying to survive, was trying to find some sense of control in a situation that felt overwhelming. And that worked. It got you here, but it doesn't have to be the only way you operate now, because you're not that child anymore. The threats that made hypervigilance necessary, they're not the same threats you're facing now. And the skills you built to survive back then, they don't have to define how you live now. You can still be curious. You can still love learning. You can still be the person who knows obscure facts and makes unexpected connections and sees patterns other people miss. But you can do all of that from a place of choice rather than compulsion, from interest rather than anxiety. From a nervous system that's allowed to rest, rather than one that's always scanning for the next thing it needs to prepare for. And once you see this pattern, once you start to recognize when the research is being driven by genuine curiosity versus when it's being driven by that old, familiar need to feel safe, something shifts. Not all at once, but slowly. You start to notice the feeling underneath the behavior. You start to catch yourself mid-spiral and ask, what am I actually trying to solve here? What feeling am I trying to manage? And sometimes, just that awareness is enough to break the loop, to let yourself put the phone down, to let the question go unanswered, to trust that you'll be okay without knowing. It was never about the information. It was always about the feeling. And the feeling was never wrong. It was just trying to protect you in the only way it knew how. But you're safe now, or at least safe now, or at least safe enough that you don't need to know everything to survive. You can let some things remain mysteries. You can trust that you'll figure it out when you need to. You can stop preparing for every possible future and start being present in the one you're actually living. And that shift, small as it sounds, changes everything.